Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books in Bytes.
Books and Bytes.
Today we're diving deep into a book that I think will make all of us think a little bit differently about success
Oh, yeah.
and luck.
Yeah.
And frankly, how much we're all just kind of winging it in life. We're talking about Fooled by Randomness
Yeah.
by Nassim Nicholas Taleb.
Oh, fantastic book.
So before we get into the nitty-gritty, can you give us kind of a quick overview of the main themes
Sure.
for those of us who haven't had a chance to read it yet?
Absolutely. So, at its core, Fooled by Randomness is exploring how much we underestimate the role of chance and luck
Okay.
in pretty much every aspect of our lives. And Taleb argues that we're kind of obsessed with finding patterns and narratives,
Yeah.
even when things are just happening randomly.
Right.
And this leads us to misinterpret random events as skill or intelligence, which can have some pretty significant consequences for how we make decisions.
So it's like attributing, winning the lottery to some sort of genius strategy rather than just pure luck.
Exactly. And that kind of thinking can be dangerous,
Right.
especially in areas like finance where randomness plays a huge role.
Yeah, that makes sense. So where does Taleb start with all of this?
Well, he kicks things off with a great story about Croesus,
Okay.
the king of Lydia, who is considered the richest man of his time. Croesus, convinced of his own happiness and success, he seeks validation from Solon,
Okay.
who's this wise Athenian lawmaker.
And I'm guessing Solon doesn't exactly offer the praise that Croesus is looking for.
No, not quite. Solon actually warns him that judging happiness based on wealth and current circumstances is pretty short-sighted because fortune is fickle. He basically says that you can't truly assess happiness until the very end of your life because things can change in an instant.
Yeah. It's kind of like that saying, don't count your chickens before they hatch.
Yeah.
You might think you've got it made, but then, bam, a giant metaphorical fox comes along and eats all your metaphorical chickens.
Exactly. And that's the point Taleb is making. We tend to get fooled by randomness, thinking we have more control over outcomes than we actually do. And that brings us to one of the, I think, central concepts of the book, black swan events.
Oh, I've heard that term before.
Yes.
But I'm not entirely sure what it means.
So a black swan is a rare, unpredictable event that has a massive impact.
Okay.
So think of things like the 2008 financial crisis or the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah.
These events kind of come out of nowhere and they completely disrupt our carefully constructed plans and predictions.
So basically, stuff happens that we never saw coming and can completely upend our lives.
Yeah.
That's a bit unsettling, to say the least.
It is, and that's why Taleb emphasizes the importance of acknowledging the role of randomness in our lives.
Okay.
We can't predict these black swan events, but we can kind of be prepared for the unexpected.
So how does Taleb illustrate this idea of black swan events and our inability to predict them?
Well, he introduces this character, Nero Tulip.
Okay.
He's a trader who becomes incredibly successful through a series of seemingly brilliant trades. And, Nero's very careful, risk-averse approach leads to significant gains, and everyone thinks he's a genius.
But I'm sensing a but coming here.
Of course. It wouldn't be a very good illustration of randomness if everything went smoothly, would it? So Nero eventually loses it all when a black swan event hits. It's called the Red Hot Summer of 1998.
Right.
And his strategy, which had worked so well in the past, completely falls apart in the face of this unforeseen market shift.
So it's like that classic gambler's fallacy.
Yeah.
Just because you've won a few hands in a row doesn't mean you're going to win the next one.
Exactly. Taleb argues that we often mistake luck for skill.
Right.
Especially when it comes to things like investing.
Yeah.
And this leads us to make bad decisions because we're basing them on flawed assumptions.
Okay, so how do we avoid falling into this trap of misinterpreting randomness as skill?
Well, one important thing to be aware of is something called survivorship bias.
Okay.
And this is where we tend to focus on the winners, the people who made it big in the market, the businesses that thrived, and we ignore all those who failed along the way.
It's like looking at a battlefield after the war is over. You see the survivors, but you don't see all the casualties that led to that victory.
A perfect analogy. And this bias can lead us to believe that success is more common and easier to achieve than it really is. We see the survivors and think, if they can do it, so can I, without considering the huge role luck played in their success.
So we're basically fooling ourselves into thinking that we have more control over our destinies than we actually do.
Precisely. And this brings us to another interesting character in the book, John, a high-yield bond trader. John, like Nero, experiences great success during a particular market boom, But when the market conditions change, guess what happened?
I'm betting he goes down in flames just like Nero.
You got it. John's story illustrates how even experienced professionals can be fooled by randomness.
Right.
They develop strategies that work well in certain conditions, but they fail to adapt when those conditions change.
So what's the lesson here? Do we just give up and accept that we're all at the mercy of random events?
Not quite. One key takeaway is to be aware of the limitations of relying on past performance as a predictor of future success. Just because something has worked in the past doesn't guarantee it will continue to work in the future.
So we need to be more adaptable and flexible in our thinking, recognizing that the rules of the game can change at any moment.
Exactly. And that's a point that Taleb drives home throughout the book. He challenges us to question our assumptions,
Yeah.
to be skeptical of narratives that seem too neat and tidy, and to always be prepared for the unexpected.
So how do we do that? How do we become less fooled by randomness?
Well, Taleb offers several strategies, and we'll dive into those as we kind of go through the book.
Okay.
But one important concept he introduces early on is this idea of alternative histories.
Alternative histories, like what if the South had won the Civil War?
Exactly. Taleb argues that we tend to view history as this kind of linear progression of events, but in reality, things could have easily turned out differently due to random factors.
So instead of thinking this is the only way things could have happened, we should consider all the other possibilities that might have unfolded if certain events hadn't occurred or if different choices had been made.
That's right. And this way of thinking can help us become more aware of the role of chance in our own lives. It reminds us that things aren't always as straightforward or predictable as they seem.
Okay, that makes sense. So are we ready to dive into the next part of the book?
Absolutely. Let's explore how Taleb uses the chilling example of Russian roulette to illustrate the dangers of extrapolating from limited data and assuming that past luck will continue indefinitely.
Ooh, that sounds intense. Let's do it.
All right, so imagine you're watching someone play Russian roulette.
Okay.
They spin the chamber, pull the trigger, and nothing happens. They do it again and again and again, each time escaping unharmed. What starts to happen in your mind?
I think I'd start to assume they have some crazy skill or like a lucky charm or something. Like they've figured out a way to beat the odds.
Exactly. But of course, that's not true.
Right.
Each spin of the chamber is an independent event. The past results have absolutely no bearing on the next spin.
So even if they've won 5 times in a row,
Yeah.
the 6th time could still be the one that, well, ends badly.
Exactly. And that's what Taleb calls the problem of induction.
Okay.
We can't assume that just because something has happened a certain way in the past, that it will continue to happen that way in the future.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this connects to the idea of being fooled by randomness.
Yeah.
We see someone having a streak of luck, and we start to attribute it to skill or some kind of special ability.
Precisely. And this can have serious consequences,
Okay.
especially when it comes to things like investing. We might see a fund manager who's had several years of stellar returns
Right.
and assume that they have some magic formula for picking winning stocks.
Right.
But what if they just got lucky?
So how do we avoid making these kinds of mistakes? How do we distinguish between luck and skill?
Well, it's not always easy. But Taleb offers some helpful tools and strategies. One of them is something called a Monte Carlo simulation.
Monte Carlo simulation. That sounds pretty complicated.
It's a powerful mathematical technique, but the basic idea is actually quite simple. Imagine creating thousands of parallel universes,
Okay.
each with slightly different starting conditions.
Yeah.
Then you run a simulation to see how things play out in each of these universes.
So it's like run a bunch of what-if scenarios to see how random events can lead to wildly different outcomes.
Exactly. And this helps us understand that even with the same starting point, things can end up very differently due to sheer chance.
That's kind of mind-blowing. It makes you realize that so much of what happens in life is outside of our control.
And that brings us to another important concept, the stove is hot principle.
Okay.
Taleb argues that we should learn from our mistakes and avoid repeating them.
Well, that seems pretty obvious. Don't touch a hot stove twice, right?
It does. But Taleb points out that we're often terrible at applying this principle in real life. Okay. We keep making the same mistakes over and over again because we fail to recognize the role of randomness.
So instead of learning from the past, we keep getting burned.
Sadly, yes. And this ties back to our tendency to see patterns where none exist. We construct narratives that explain our successes and failures, even when those narratives are based on pure chance.
So how do we break out of this cycle of repeating mistakes?
Taleb suggests practicing distilled thinking.
Oh,
This means cutting through all the noise and clutter
right.
and focusing on the essential principles that really matter.
So it's like filtering out all the irrelevant information and getting to the heart of the matter.
Exactly. And this is particularly important in today's world where we're bombarded with information from all sides.
Okay, that makes sense. So where does Taleb take us next?
Well, he spends quite a bit of time exploring how the scientific method, with its emphasis on falsifiability and rigorous testing, provides a framework for navigating a world filled with randomness.
So science is a way to try and make sense of the chaos.
In a way, yes. The scientific method encourages us to test our hypotheses, to look for evidence that might disprove our theories,
Okay.
and to be open to changing our minds when presented with new information.
That sounds like a pretty good approach to life in general, not just science.
Absolutely. And Taleb contrasts this with the world of finance,
Yeah.
where past performance is often mistakenly seen as a reliable predictor of future success.
But haven't we already talked about how relying on past performance can be misleading?
Yes, but it's such a common fallacy that Taleb keeps coming back to it throughout the book. He
Oh.
uses a striking example,
Great.
Monte Carlo poetry, to highlight the role of chance in even creative endeavors.
Monte Carlo poetry, what is that?
Imagine a computer program that randomly combines words to generate poems.
Okay.
It might seem absurd,
Yeah.
but some of the resulting poems can be surprisingly coherent and even beautiful.
So even in something as subjective as poetry, randomness can play a role.
Absolutely, and this makes it even harder to distinguish between true skill and just lucky combinations.
Right.
Taleb even introduces the concept of a reverse Turing test to further explore this idea.
A reverse Turing test. I'm intrigued.
It's a thought experiment that challenges the idea of inherent meaning in language. Imagine trying to create a text that's so convincingly human-like that it could fool someone into thinking it was written by a person,
Right.
not a machine.
So it's like flipping the traditional Turing test on its head. Instead of trying to determine if a machine can think like a human, we're trying to create a machine that can write like a human.
Exactly. And this gets at the heart of the problem of separating skill from randomness. If we can't even tell if something was created by a human or a random process,
Right.
how can we be sure that what we're seeing is truly the result of skill?
Okay, my mind is officially blown. So where do we go from here?
Well, Taleb then shifts gears and introduces us to another fascinating character, Carlos, the emerging markets wizard.
Ooh, another cautionary tale.
You could say that.
Hmm.
Carlos initially finds great success investing in risky bonds, particularly in emerging markets. He becomes known as a financial genius, but then the Russian financial crisis hits in 1998, and everything changes.
I bet Carlos learned a hard lesson about the dangers of randomness.
He does indeed. His downfall exemplifies the pitfalls of a strategy called averaging down.
Okay.
This involves buying more of a losing asset
Right.
in the hope of recovering losses.
So if a stock you bought is going down, you buy even more of it. That seems counterintuitive.
It can be, but the logic is that by buying more at a lower price, you lower your average costs
Okay.
and increase your potential gains if the asset eventually rebounds.
But what if it keeps going down?
Then you just keep losing more money. And that's exactly what happened to Carlos. He kept buying more bonds as their value plummeted, and eventually he lost everything.
So averaging down is a trap.
It can be, especially if you're not careful. And Taleb highlights how the herd mentality on Wall Street can amplify these kinds of mistakes.
Herd mentality.
Yeah. As Carlos's success grew, other traders followed his lead, buying into the same risky bonds without fully understanding the risks involved. And when the market crashed, everyone went down together.
So it's like a financial version of lemmings running off a cliff.
A rather dramatic analogy.
Yeah.
But yes,
Yeah.
the herd mentality can lead to irrational decision-making and magnify the impact of random events.
Okay, so we've seen how randomness can fool both individual investors and entire markets. What else does Taleb have in store for us?
Well, he then dives into a more technical discussion of probability and statistics, exploring concepts like skewness and asymmetry. But he does it in a way that's still engaging and accessible,
Okay.
using real-world examples to illustrate the key points.
So he doesn't get too bogged down in the mathematical weeds.
Not at all. He even that it often obscures the reality of randomness and risk.
So it's like using fancy language to make things sound more complicated and impressive than they really are. Exactly. And this ties back to one of the main themes of the book, the dangers of being fooled by appearances. We might think someone is a financial genius because they use sophisticated terminology,
Right.
but that doesn't necessarily mean they know what they're doing.
So we need to look beyond the surface and try to understand the underlying principles.
Precisely. And Taleb provides the tools and insights to help us do just that.
This is all incredibly fascinating. I can't wait to see where he takes us next. Okay, so we've seen how randomness can really mess with our perception of skill, especially in finance. But how do we deal with that in our own lives? Do we just throw up our hands and say whatever happens, happens?
Well, Taleb certainly wouldn't advocate for that kind of completely passive approach.
Okay.
He actually offers some pretty practical advice in the book.
Right.
And this is why I think it gets really interesting.
Okay, lay it on me. What's the secret to not being constantly fooled by randomness?
Well, there's no magic bullet, of course.
Right.
But Taleb highlights a key idea, and that's understanding the difference between positive and negative exposure to randomness.
Positive and negative, what does that even mean in this context?
So think of it this way. A negative exposure is like being in a situation where the potential losses are way bigger than the potential gains.
Okay.
It's like betting your entire life savings on a single hand of poker.
Yikes. Yeah, that doesn't sound like a winning strategy.
Exactly. And that's the kind of exposure to randomness we want to avoid.
Right.
On the flip side, a positive exposure is one where the potential upside outweighs the potential downside. It's like investing in a diversified portfolio.
Okay.
Even if some investments go down, others might go up, balancing things out.
So it's about spreading out your risk and not putting all your eggs in one basket.
Precisely. And this applies not just to investing, but to other areas of life as well. Maybe you're considering a career change.
Yeah.
Instead of jumping all in on one path, could you explore a few different options and kind of keep your options open?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like having a plan B, just in case things don't go as expected.
Exactly. And that ties in nicely with Taleb's discussion of the Stoic philosophy.
Ah, the Stoics. Didn't they believe in just accepting whatever fate throws at you?
Well, that's a common misconception. Stoicism is actually about recognizing what you can control and what you can't.
Okay.
You can't control external events like market crashes or pandemics, but you can control your own actions and reactions.
So it's about focusing on what you can influence and not stressing about things that are outside of your control.
Exactly. And Taleb uses the story of Antony,
Okay.
the Roman general, to illustrate this point. Despite facing numerous setbacks and ultimately losing to Octavian,
Right.
Antony never gave up hope and always maintained his dignity.
It's like that famous quote, it's not about what happens to you, but how you react to it.
Precisely. And that's a core principle of Stoicism.
Mhm.
It's about developing resilience in the face of adversity.
Okay, so how do we apply this Stoic wisdom to our everyday lives?
Well, Taleb encourages us to focus on what we can control, our own actions, our thoughts, our values. We can't control the outcome of every situation,
Right.
but we can control how we approach those situations.
So it's about having a strong internal compass that kind of guides us through the inevitable ups and downs of life.
Exactly. And that brings us to another key takeaway from the book,
Okay.
the importance of intellectual humility.
Humility in the context of randomness. I don't quite follow.
Taleb argues that we should always be willing to admit when we're wrong.
Okay.
We should be skeptical of our own beliefs and open to changing our minds when presented with new evidence.
So it's about acknowledging that we don't have all the answers and that we can always learn something new.
Exactly. And this is especially important in fields like finance, where the illusion of control can be very seductive. We might think we figured out the market,
Right.
but randomness can always come along and throw us a curveball.
So instead of being arrogant and overconfident, we should approach things with a healthy dose of skepticism and a willingness to adapt.
Precisely. And that's a good rule of thumb for life in general, not just finance.
Wow, this has been a really insightful deep dive. So if we had to sum up the main message of fooled by randomness in just a few sentences, what would it be?
I think it would be this. Randomness plays a far bigger role in our lives than we often realize.
Yeah.
We're constantly being fooled by it, misinterpreting luck as skill and order as design.
Right.
But by understanding the nature of randomness and adopting a stoic mindset of resilience and humility,
Yeah.
we can avoid its pitfalls and even harness its power for our own benefit.
That's a brilliant summary.
Mhm.
And I think it's a message that everyone can benefit from hearing.
I agree. Fooled by Randomness is one of those books that can really change the way you see the world.
Well, thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive. It's been a real pleasure.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to all our listeners out there, we hope you enjoyed this exploration of food by randomness. Until next time on Books and Bites.